Gassia, good morning. I'm very glad that finally we managed to arrange this conversation. You're a judge at the Superior Court in Orange County, California. You've been a lawyer for many, many years. But our audience is probably more interested in your intensive activity in another organization called CFTJ, Center for Truth and Justice. At this center, you've done crucially important work in terms of gathering, documenting, validating testimonials and information about the war crimes of Azerbaijan, about human rights abuses, about atrocities. As far as I could count, you've done over 350, gathered 350 eyewitness testimonials from POWs or their families. You've produced 2 white papers, which have gone to the US Congress. You've helped in filings with the European Court of Justice. You've produced evidence which has been used in the International Court of Justice. Extremely busy schedule. And last May, you organized a wonderful 3-day conference here in Yerevan, and I attended it remotely, and it was an extremely impressive event, by the way. Now, I would love to talk about how all this work, all this evidence gathering has been used, or you would like it to use. But first, clearly, all this activity does not fit in the job description of a judge. So there must be another factor at work here. And my guess is it's your connection to Armenia, it's your connection to Artsakh. Why don't we start with a little background on how that connection has worked? What's the history behind it?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you for doing this. I think my story is very similar to millions of other Armenians. I grew up in the diaspora in Lebanon. I grew up with my grandmother. During the civil war in Lebanon, I actually went to live in Aleppo, Syria with my grandmother for 2 years. And she was born in 1900. So that obviously tells you, she was born in Kharpert. That obviously tells you the story of the survivor from the genocide. And there used to be a picture of a woman in her bedroom. And I asked her one day, I was 9 or 10 years old, who's this woman? And she said, it's her daughter. I mean, I know my aunts. So I didn't realize that she had lost her first child when she was 15 years old in the genocide. And she had found her in 1932. And this daughter had repatriated to Armenia in the 1948 from Egypt. So suddenly I realized, I have cousins and an aunt in Armenia that I've never heard of or I've never met. First time I went to Armenia was months after the earthquake. I went with an organization called Land and Culture, and I volunteered to work in the earthquake zone, and that was the first time I met my first cousins. And I lived in a village above Spitak. It was love at first sight. When I was leaving that village, I knew I was coming back. I was in law school when the Soviet Union was falling apart and Armenia became independent. Everybody was applying to corporate jobs and law firms. I was trying to find a job somehow to go to Armenia, and I did. The Armenian Assembly gave me that opportunity, and in 1992, a week after I took the bar exam, I packed my bags, moved to Armenia. Wow. And that's where, when and where the adventure started. Your first love is always forever your love. Yep. Armenia is my first love. And my career developed. Obviously, I worked in Armenia many years, then returned, went to Washington, D.C., worked, did a lot of advocacy work. And then I walked away, basically. But then during the elections in 1998, I was called back to Armenia because I used to work for a Democratic Progressive PAC in Washington, D.C., doing campaign work. Mm-hmm. So if Armenia calls, I'm going to go. That's all there is to it.
Regardless of who's there, right?
Doesn't matter. If Armenia wants me, I am there because it's my first love. So we moved back to Armenia in 1998, this time married with a 6-month-old child. And as you remember, there were parliamentary assassinations in 1999.
Yep.
I used to work for the Kocharyan administration. I resigned, returned to the US, and pursued my legal career, pulled out my bar card, and started practicing law. I was a public defender for a long time. And if anyone who knows what a public defender does, we defend the underdog. And Armenians have been the underdog for hundreds of years. So it was just a natural match that I would take up the cause of Armenia. But I'll be honest with you, up until the 44-day war, it's just like everybody else. We thought Armenia was going to be okay.
Yep.
Right. So I
Yep.
basically walked away and pursued my career. Right. And my career led me to becoming appointed by Governor Brown. And during the 44-day war, I sat in the corner of my couch and stared at my phone and was absolutely horrified. Don't forget what I handle criminal cases in court. I handle felonies. I listen to victim impact statements day in and day out. I sentence people to 10, 20, 30 life sentences, right? So watching what Azerbaijan was doing, this combination of the granddaughter of a genocide survivor, my love for Armenia, and my strong sense of justice, if I can do it for the people of Orange County, my goodness, I have to be able to do something for my own people.
Absolutely.
So that was the natural connection, where a bunch of lawyers and I got together, and my first instinct was, we got to gather some hardcore evidence. Someone's got to do hardcore evidence gathering, because I just want to tell you, Vahan, the government can do a fantastic job, but it's tainted naturally because it's by the government.
Yes.
You need independent third party doing the investigation. That's what we do in court, right? Yeah. Otherwise, evidence is either on this side or the other side.
And you can do the investigation more professionally, probably, right? And it stands better in court coming from an organization like you than from one of the sides.
Armenia, because it's a former Soviet state, does not have a tradition of independent evidence gathering, okay? In the United States, first year of law school, an entire year we study the Code of Evidence. And the purpose of the Code of Evidence is to learn how to make evidence admissible, how to make it credible, how to create chain of custody. It's long and complicated. So we knew Armenia did not have this tradition. And the international courts that were established right after World War II were actually established by the federal courts in the United States. It's copied off of that system. So the evidence code is the evidence code. It doesn't matter where you go. Yes. So we decided to teach the evidence code to young law students and implement gathering of evidence based on those international standards. Wonderful. And thus the Center for Truth and Justice came forward.
Yeah. I could relate to two aspects of your personal story. First, my first visit to Armenia was to gather about over 100 relatives that I've never met before in my life and find them. And second, of course, the impact of the war. It changed everything. But let's come back to the evidence that you gathered all this time. And how is it being used? How would you like it to be used?
We do not gather evidence from anybody that was a combatant or a fighter, unless they were specifically a victim to something specific, like mercenaries or war crimes. 90% of our evidence is gathered from civilians. Because first of all, accountability involves money. The world is about money, all right? You have to be able to put a price on the damage that Azerbaijan has done to a population. When 100,000 Armenians were displaced, many did go back to Karabakh, but Hadrut and Shushi are emptied. Yep. And a few months ago, they emptied Aravno and Berdzor. There's a price to this. Yep. So we take evidence from displaced people and literally try to put a price on it. We don't price it. but we gather their deeds and pictures of what their homes looked like, what their belongings were, and what has happened to this family now.
Gassia, let me shift a little bit in a different direction, because there's been recently revelations, reports, whatever you want to call it, about the existence of very large multi-billion-dollar slush funds owned by the Azeri government, which they've used to either bribe politicians in Europe or to do some serious lobbying in the United States. I mean, we may not be able to 100% prove this in the court of law. I don't know if we can, but the evidence is kind of, the circumstantial evidence at least, is overwhelming. Have you encountered any of this in your work? Has it popped up in front of you while you're trying to gather all this evidence and all this information?
Not directly, but indirectly, and I'll just explain a few things. Multiple governments have investments in Azerbaijan, okay? And they're not withdrawing their investments. And the investments are not necessarily by governments, but it's through private companies.
Yeah.
So for example, we've all seen Aliyev boast about building this new modern city on the lands that they took back from Armenia and Armenians after ethnic cleansing and slaughtering people out of the city, specifically Hadrut, for example, and then followed by Shushi. Anyone who builds on the blood spilled is part and parcel of war crimes. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. Wow. The dots are all there. We got to get them connected.
What's the most urgent burning projects you're working on now as CFTJ?
The hottest topic right now is in the International Court of Justice, which last year, December 7 of 21, provisional decisions were made, which set precedent, by the way, Vahan. ICJ has never come down with decisions of the type that they did. It has set new precedent for all international law. That basically said, because POWs are not a part of the ICJ, specifically under the Third Convention, which is Convention Against Racial Discrimination. That's the article that's being used by Armenia in bringing suit against Azerbaijan. They came down with 3 very specific provisional decisions telling Azerbaijan, you cannot destroy cultural heritage sites. You have to treat POWs humanely. And then there's the larger discrimination issue of Armenians and how they're being treated. Now, the hot topic for us is January of 2023 is the trial where jurisdiction is going to be argued. Armenia needs to win that battle because Azerbaijan's claim is that Armenia has no jurisdiction at the ICJ. I'm confident that we will win that phase. Once we get jurisdiction over, a year from that will be the trial, the main trial, okay? So all of this evidence that we have is being used. How do you establish jurisdiction? You establish jurisdiction by facts. You show them what have they done, right? So all of this evidence we're talking about is being used and was used even in the provisional decision. In fact, the Center for Truth and Justice reports were quoted. So we know our evidence is being used.
That's great.
And we got to keep it up. We can't stop. But we have some serious deadlines. We got to get specific evidence collected. We know exactly what it is. Vahan, it's hard, and I'm going to tell you what's hard, and you'll understand my pain. Armenians in Armenia are not a litigious society. You know, their point is, what's the point?
Exactly.
You know, what's going to happen to what I tell you? What's the point of this evidence? Are they going to bring Hadrut back? Are they going to give me Shushi back? No, of course not. Maybe in the future. I don't know. But if you don't play, you're not a part of the game. If you're not part of the game, you're outside of the system. And if you're outside the system, no one's going to pay attention. So the legal system is yet one more pressure point. But it's a very important pressure point because the ICJ decision cannot be appealed. It's final. It can't go anywhere further. Their decision is their decision. And if we don't set some precedent, How do we hold Azerbaijan accountable?
Absolutely.
This is a long game, okay? This is not a short version game. We have our eye for the long term, what's going to happen 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And if we don't have that attitude, then forever we're going to be outside of that international legal community. We're forcing Armenians' hands to become part and parcel of that larger international community. You remember during the 44-day war, what were people saying? The world's forgotten us. No one's doing anything about us.
Exactly. Even now, that's being said.
But if you don't call on them, if you don't put their feet to the fire, if you don't write reports, if you don't demand, if you don't ask, if you don't go to these places,
I agree.
People are going to say, oh, right? The poor Armenians. We got to leave. So here's the thing. CFTJ's main principle is we are not a victim nation anymore.
Exactly.
Okay? To stop being a victim nation, you have to take action. You have to take things into your hands. And ain't no one come. The Americans and the French and the Swiss are not going to come and gather evidence and take our cases to court. We got to do it. We're also not an Armenian organization. We're a US-based organization. We're a US organization, okay? Most of our members are Armenians, but we have non-Armenians who believe in the same cause because human rights is human rights everywhere in the world. And we belong to, we belong to larger coalition this way.
And Azerbaijan must have taken notice about some of this activity because they've started an enormous counteroffensive on the information war. They're talking about Armenians having erased their history and Armenian atrocities and so on, even though there is no way they can gather the kind of evidence that you guys are gathering and make the kind of cases that can be made with the evidence that you're gathering. I don't think that's even possible on their side.
Well, that's why part of our name is the truth. You can gather evidence, but it's got to be the truth.
Yeah.
It can't be fake news.
Yeah, it cannot be fake news. And there's a lot of fake news, by the way. Gassia, I'd like to shift to something entirely different because I'd love to hear your take on a situation globally in terms of the geopolitical situation in the world. There is no question that there are major geopolitical shifts. Part of it, most recently, it was triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but even before that, it had started. And what brought this even more focus in my attention is some of the latest statements by the president of Turkey saying that the world order, post-war world order has finished. That world order was established for the benefit of the victors in that war, and now it's no longer valid, and now the new world order is going to emerge. Now, if you take this, clearly there are here ambitions on the part of Turkey to become much more powerful and much more prominent in whatever new world order that they're imagining. But together there is some evidence of this in the sense that, in parts of the Middle East, the Gulf, Africa, the influence of the United States has waned. I can see it in all kinds of evidence for this. Russian influence has waned clearly after the war. China has emerged. Turkey wants to emerge. So there's clearly a moving of the tectonic plates geopolitically in the region that's going to affect very much Armenia. Now, I have my perspective of looking at this as in my career, but I'd love to hear your perspective from a legal and human rights point of view. What does this mean? How do you see things evolving in the region?
Turkey's ambitions are really clear. They don't make a secret out of it. It is this connecting, it's not even the old Ottoman Empire, it's a much larger plan because what stands between us and the rest of their Turkic brothers? Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, right? What stands between them? Between Turkey and China, there's Armenia.
Yep.
We're literally the speed bump that they just want to plow through and get rid of.
Yep.
Okay? And it's this larger, because if you look at any of the recent gatherings, the leadership of those stans that I'm talking about, the Turkmenistan and all those countries, and Erdogan and Aliyev, they walk hand in hand. I mean, they don't, it's not a secret. There's this larger plan, right? Which obviously is not something that Russia's happy about. But the United States has been very slow to analyze and see the big picture, right? Because let's face it, the U.S. administrations are around only 4 years, right? And the first 2 years is mostly when they can make some policy. The last 2 years, they're fighting for their seats again.
Yep.
So there's a fast turnover in the United States, and you have to sort of do something about it in the first 2 years of any administration. I'll tell you what's a huge shift in the world from a human rights perspective. The world is shifting towards fascism again. All right. Even in Europe, look what's happening in Italy. All right. This is a very, very scary shift. The number of displaced people in the world is the largest it's ever been. Absolutely. Historically. Okay. And human rights atrocities are fed by guns being sold all over the world, whether it's Israel or the United States or Russia. So it's a market. I mean, if you have guns, you have to sell it. If you're going to sell it, it's going to be used. And once there's war, there's human rights violations. There are war crimes. I mean, nobody fights a clean war.
I wish the courts had a lot more power to enforce decisions in a situation like this, because it's going to be very difficult. You know, if you have a coalition right now in our region, in the Caucasus, I'm convinced we have an understanding between Turkey, Russia, and Azerbaijan. There is an understanding. There is a kind of, I mean, it may be fragile, it may not last, but right now, under current conditions, there's an understanding. When those three agree, the first victim is Armenia, okay, or the most vulnerable country in that situation is Armenia. The only thing that can help here is if Europe, United States find a newfound interest in all this and do come, like European delegation has come here to observe the border. I mean, that's new. There's a new US congressional delegation is supposed to come. But behind this congressional delegation and so on, there has to be executive muscle. And I haven't yet seen the executive muscle. I hope if that comes, and short of the executive muscle, maybe the courts can compensate somewhat. And that's where your work becomes absolutely critical, Gassia. That's the.
So this is a really sad fact, but I'll tell you, what's happening in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, and the war crimes. The world is realizing Ukraine has the same issues Armenia does. There's no agency because Ukraine, just like Armenia, is not a member of the ICC. And where do you go? Where do you go with your war crimes? So both Europe and the United States are now moving legislation to actually open up doors for tribunals and war crimes to be prosecuted. That is an advantage for Armenia. All right. Yeah. Armenia needs to take advantage of these opportunities. So there's definitely a shift. The other thing that is a strong asset for Armenia, and when I say strong, it is absolutely the only asset, if you ask me, is being a democratic country. We stand out. And Vahan, I know it's hard to look at it from this perspective right now, but the long game is that these totalitarian countries cannot continue doing what they're doing. And that's an asset that we're using, and we have to use more and more.
Gassia, I hate to say this, but we've ran out of time. But let me stress, in the closing, let me say this. Short of taking a machine gun and standing at the border and defending Armenia, you're doing probably the next most important thing. Because without this, again, will be so many crimes against Armenians historically have been forgotten, have been denied. And in the very least, denial will not be possible given that your work and the importance of your work. Thank you so much. Thanks for this interview or this conversation. And if we can do anything to help meet some of your own challenges, please let us know.
Thanks, Vahan.
Thank you.